So, so morning or evening or afternoon or middle of the night to everyone else. I see some faces that I recognise. Jill, hi there, good to see you. We will probably see some more people joining, but we are going to get started. So welcome to our second Global Book Club. And we have the wonderful Katherine Trebeck, who is joining us for the second and last time, sadly, after a very successful first session. And as you'll know, that Katherine is a political economist. She has a number of areas of work that she undertakes. And the one that we're really focusing on is one of her books, and I guess an interrogation of the idea of the well-being economy and an engagement with some of the elements of Katherine's work that are relevant to healthcare, health policy, health workforce, and nursing in particular. And we have a group of our early career nurses, and they were able to take a chapter each or three of the chapters each and have a dialogue with Katherine, and they posed a couple of key questions to her. And I have to say, she was very impressed. Who knew nurses could talk about economics and health economic policy and the relevance of it in quite a high level way? So that was quite, I guess, maybe a surprise for Katherine, but maybe not. And no, she's thinking, no, it definitely wasn't. But maybe it's more about how nurses will engage with this topic and how they can have some type of literacy and some type of dialogue that they can take away with them when they're engaging in advocacy work and they are trying to influence. As we know, nurses are obviously the largest workforce. We give and provide direct care or preventative care or care in conflict, disasters. And outside of that, there is a geopolitical landscape that we need to navigate and understand because it heavily influences us as individuals and as a global workforce. And what we're trying to do here is stimulate and slightly aggravate the status quo and put a little grit in the ointment, because we want to be part of these discussions. We want to understand the dialogue. We want to have a viewpoint. We want to present the evidence. And hopefully some of this discussion is not really about, at the end of this, you're literate in everything to do with health economics, health policy with economic background, but that you are thoughtful about it. And now it's on your radar, and hopefully it will stimulate you to go and find out a little bit more and ask questions of your nursing associations, of your ministers, and of your government, and of your profession. So I think that's all I really want to say. It's wonderful to see Jill White here, hugely influential nurse, and within her own right, but also with regards Nursing Now and Nursing Now Challenge. She was part of the journey of Nursing Now and very influential in that, and has continued to be so on our board, not just Nursing Now board, but the Nursing Now Challenge board. And Jill is a great grit in the ointment for everything, and definitely stimulates discussion. So if we're looking for some questions from those of us who are joining us today and for the recording, then I'm sure Jill and some other colleagues who have joined us from that neck of the woods globally might be able to maybe pose some interesting reflections and questions. So I'm going to hand over to Katherine, who is just going to maybe highlight some of the key issues from the book, and we'll lead straight into the discussion with each of the three chapters that have been chosen: Chapter 5, Chapter 7, Chapter 10. And you'll hear from our early career nurses and their discussion with Katherine. Thank you so much. Over to you, Katherine.
Thanks, Aisha, and hi, everyone. Really wonderful to be back again, reconvening the conversation. I had such a great time last time. It was just one of the best discussions I've had, and I really enjoyed the voices and perspectives from such different contexts. Speaking of contexts, I'm coming to you from Canberra, otherwise known as Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Australia, and I really want to acknowledge that the land I'm speaking to you from is unceded, and give my respects to Aboriginal people over the generations, particularly for all the care that they just inherently take care of our beautiful natural home. So I wanted to do very briefly a recap of a couple of the key points of the book. One is that it starts out really acknowledging that the economic recipes that have, over the sort of late 20th century, have largely been centered around economic growth. And that growth, when it's been used well, this is quite a big caveat, when it's been used well to invest in collective institutions like health systems, sanitation, education systems, then it has led to quite incredible progress of various aspects. And I think many of you will probably have your favorite example of human progress over the last few decades, whether that's rising literacy rates, or maybe rising levels of life expectancy in certain countries, or infant mortality rates falling, and so on. And there's lots of examples of that. What the book does, though, is say, yes, let's acknowledge those fruits of growth, but also let's really recognize that where we stand now is that some of those fruits of growth are beginning to rot, in the sense that we're looking at a very, very unequal world within countries, particularly horizontal and vertical inequalities. So that's between sort of economic inequalities, but also in terms of race and gender and so on. And also it's a world that's becoming profoundly unsafe, in the sense that we as, and I'm going to say we as society, but of course, a really crucial point is that it's not all of humanity. It's those with the most wealth who are pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle. And we see that you'll probably all see that in various manifestations in the communities where you are. You see that in the scientific literature, just where, scientists who are normally pretty conservative are shouting louder and louder, and really not pulling their punches anymore. The extent to which the planet is really struggling, given the production and consumption systems. And we're seeing just in the last few weeks, unprecedented, continuous above 50 degrees days in India, people dying in Mecca for the Hajj because of the heat. Just the latest examples, last year being the hottest year on record, ocean temperatures this year being, stratospherically higher than they were last year. So Mother Nature is struggling with the way the world, and again, that really crucial caveat that it's not everyone, it's a certain, the wealthiest who are putting most pressure on the planet. It's also those fruits of growth are really not leading to good lives for people. And we see people feeling alienated from each other, from nature, feeling rising levels of loneliness, anxiety, self-harm. In the UK a few years ago, the head teachers associations were saying that rising levels of self-harm, particularly amongst young women, were what they called a slow-growing epidemic. And we talked about how people are reaching for coping mechanisms. And I often say that they're reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox. And that's a shorthand for saying, reaching for coping mechanisms through drugs or alcohol or retail therapy even. But also, as we've seen in the last few years, and even recently in Europe in the last few weeks, at the ballot box, with the rise of sort of populist apparent solutions, very simplistic solutions, usually for a particular group, that of course are very, very insincere in terms of the solutions offered by the populist politicians, often on the far right, are not going to deliver the sort of lives that people want. But it's a very, it's a knee-jerk reaction to just people feeling their lives are out of control, knowing that their children will not have better futures than they will, because of the way the economy is working, because of the way wealth has not trickled down, but has been siphoned up to those at the top, and also because of the various aspects of environmental breakdown. So we're in a position where we need to really take a pause and think, well, have those recipes of the past that were used by policymakers run out of puff? And maybe it's time to really dare to ask questions that are so often forbidden. And this is where the idea of the economics of arrival, that's the title of the book, comes in. And I think last time when we chatted, I told the story of how my co-author Jeremy and I, when we first met, I was in a little coffee shop in London, down a little sweet little alleyway, and I was telling him how frustrated I was with some of these dynamics. And he said, Katherine, countries like the UK or yours, you're Australian, or Canada, or the US, those rich countries in GDP terms, they need to recognize that they've arrived. And there was something very powerful about that framing, arrival, because of course, arriving somewhere is quite so often a really positive moment. But what do you do then when you arrive? You stop and you make yourself at home. You make sure everyone has got enough, and you take care of the context that you're in. And so the part two of the idea of the economics of arrival is, and I think it's probably even the more important one, is to make ourselves at home. So it's really about saying, can we dare to ask, has this goal of economic development that's so often really pushed through the lens of economic growth measured through GDP, can we dare to ask this so often forbidden question? Has that got a destination? Have we got there in a sort of collective sense? Have countries like the one I'm speaking to you from, a country like Australia, one of the richest countries in the world in GDP terms, in financial wealth terms, have we got enough? And actually now the task is to make ourselves at home with that wealth. And that means sharing it much better, because of course there's huge inequalities in countries like mine. If you've arrived collectively, doesn't mean that everyone's doing okay. So you have to think about, how do you share that wealth? But also really critically taking care of the resources. And so then we moved into the conversation around, well, what would that economy look like? And since I wrote the book, the idea of the well-being economy has really emerged and got a lot of legs in civil society, in academia, even in big international institutions like the WHO are really speaking about this idea of the well-being economy. So the well-being economy is essentially an economy that makes itself at home, that shares and cherishes the resources much, much better. And we talked a little bit about some of the dimensions of that, particularly around business models like worker cooperatives. We talked about the role of government in shaping the nature of the economy. We talked about issues around trade. We talked really also how nurses are so often at the sharp end of an economic system that hasn't allowed itself to think about, has it arrived, or that's just pushing down faster on the pedal of economic growth. And nurses often see how, and there's a book that we talked about where the title of the book is The Body Bears the Scars. And so often, nurses are seeing how the body bears the scars of an unequal system, of a system that's not taking care of each other, that's not giving people a sense of control over their lives, it's not providing a sense of dignity. And then we also talked a little bit about the role of nurses as agents of change, and how collectively, but also as individually, in their different contexts and different contexts, that this will play out differently because of the safety of civil society space and ability to protest and so on. But we talked about how even there's different steps people can take, whether that's joining up as a nurses union, or whether that's thinking about even when you're on your way home and you're picking up groceries or provisions, where do you buy them? Where do you even think about, if you're able to have a pension, where's that invested? So it depends on context, of course, but really thinking about what are the different steps that people can take collectively as individuals. And then, of course, it was fantastic because the various colleagues here picked up different aspects of the book, and we went into discussion about that. So Aisha, I'll stop there and we can turn to the next questions. And then I'm really excited about the conversations we're going to have around how we can bring about change together.
Brilliant, brilliant. And just to remind everybody, we are recording this, and we will share it with our network, and everyone can engage with it if you've not made it today. And Katherine, just listening to you now, I was listening to a programme yesterday on Radio 5 Live about the NHS in the UK, because obviously we have our elections coming up, and what could we do? So you had to phone in, and it was a discussion with a presenter called Nihal, who is, I really enjoy listening to his shows. And he was asking people, real people, what was it? What was the solution? And just listening to you now, I was thinking, oh, I wish Katherine had been on that call or one of our nurses, because that is the solution. It's not difficult. It's actually quite simple and straightforward. And yeah, I'm just listening to you, and I hope that people were writing messages or notes to themselves about some of these key messages that we need to get out there. And rather than saying and focusing, and of course we have to focus on what's wrong and uncover it, but we've become very blasé or accepting of something we have here in the UK called corridor care. And it's the norm now that patients are on trolleys in corridors. That is normal. It's an expectation. Nobody's outraged about it anymore. And how can you call that care? That is not care in a corridor on a trolley for 48 hours and patients are dying. That is not acceptable. However, it's become acceptable. So sometimes it is about us changing the narrative and actually demanding and actually saying, what is it you need to do? Why are you not doing this? Because if we keep focusing on what is wrong, that is taking our eyes off what it is they should be doing. And listening to you, it really, honestly, I feel so strongly, as you can see, about you talking about this and why this is such an important session that we have, where this is hopefully entry level for a lot of our nurses who are listening in about what is it we're meaning. And Jill's just putting in here, corridor care is everywhere in Australia too at the moment. It's ridiculous. So I really, really am so grateful for your time and some of these key messages. And if we can just hang on to those and take those out there and start, having that as part of our advocacy work. And I've got lots of ideas about how we can do that moving forward. So, and I'm sure everyone else
if I can just build on that, Aisha, and in the book, I think Jeremy counted that there are examples of different ways of doing things from over 50 countries, different ways of doing food systems, different ways of designing businesses, different ways of doing production and consumption, so that, lots of the circular economy. And I think that's where we can find a lot of hope, because the project of economic system change is enormous. I mean, we're really talking about quite a fundamental shift in how we think about the economy, and then, of course, how we deliver the economy. But the really critical thing is that it's not a step into the unknown, because there are examples of what a different economic system, one that's aligned with what people and planet need. There are examples of different ways of doing that around the world, in microcosm and sometimes even in larger scale. And since the book came out, I'm not saying it's because of the book, but we're seeing even formation of a group of what the name is called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. And that was created by initially Scotland, New Zealand, and Iceland. And they first met in 2018. And I'll be really honest with you, when COVID hit, I thought it would just be disbanded, because what this is government officials, so not so much the political level, but government officials getting together to really learn from each other about how to put collective well-being at the heart of economic policy making. And all those different countries were working on different aspects of that. So Scotland, for example, was sharing its work with the National Performance Framework and for-purpose business models. New Zealand was sharing its work with the Wellbeing Budget. Iceland was sharing its experience with a multidimensional wellbeing framework and its gender equality work, for example. And when COVID hit, I thought, well, though, the governments are in this incredible crisis, they're going to see something like WeGo, the Wellbeing Economy Government, as a luxury, and it'll be just kicked into the long grass. And yet I was so wrong, and I'm so delighted to be proved wrong, because what happened is it really came into its own, and they started meeting fairly regularly on Zoom, usually late at night for the Scots and very early morning for the Kiwis, as you can imagine. And who else started to join? Well, Wales joined, Finland joined, Canada joined, and now I know there's a few Aussies on the call, and they'll be pleased to know that now Australia is there as an observer as well through our federal treasury, wanting to learn and take lessons from other countries. So it's not, there's lots of small scale examples, and then also some of the, this is starting to enter the corridors of power. So it's not a step into the unknown. We just need to help that these incredible pioneering examples no longer be the exception that proves the rule, but they need to be the normal way of doing the economy. I'm going to talk about that a bit more later, so I'll shut up now because I know we've got some great questions.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's great to have kind of that energy in the room here, and that we can be together as one and think about what we can do and create a manifesto from this. I think is what we need to do after this book club, I think. And with your help, we could do that and put that out there, because I think we need to be very clear what the message is and that there are solutions. And it's not, well, this is really difficult. Well, lots of things are difficult, but it doesn't mean you don't do them. Okay, so we're on to chapter 5 and named Rushing Past Our Stop. And we have Ibrahim from Nigeria and we have Aaron from Taiwan. And over to you both. I'm looking for Aaron. Yeah, are you there? Are you going first? I can't see.
I'm going first.
Yeah, okay, super.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yep. Hello, everyone, and so glad to see you again, Katherine. So my question for this chapter, this would be the government have increased nurse salaries to attract more individual to the profession. I think worldwide, yet the turnover rate remains high, and the working environment has not improved. Could this be an example of the failure demand? And if so, what steps should be taken first to create a meaningful change?
Great question, Aaron, and wonderful to see you again. I might give a slightly longer answer here by way of to explain to those who weren't with us last time the concept of failure demand. I think it's a really useful toehold almost to use as you sort of wade your way through economic discussion that you hear. It's quite a, I think, a really useful sort of idea to shine a light on some of the crazy inefficiencies and paradoxes of the current economic system. The term failure demand comes from management literature. There's a guy called John Seddon who's, one of these sort of management gurus and probably writes fancy books that you'd maybe see in the airport. And he talked about saying to companies, well, if you're getting loads of phone calls to your call center, not always a good thing if a lot of those phone calls are complaints about your product. So that's the idea of sort of, failure demand. More demand for something isn't necessarily a good thing if it's a sign of the product not working. In 2012 in Scotland, and I know there's a few folks, and Aaron, you're based in Scotland, I think, aren't you? And in 2012, there was a big commissioned by the Scottish government into the future of public services. And one of the things they looked at is the increasing demand for public services. And partly due to the aging populations, the aging demographic, but also they said a lot of the demand for various responses from various parts of the Scottish government and from local government was due to poverty and inequality. And so essentially the collective failure to create good lives for enough people, to ensure that everyone has enough to live on, a sense of control, a sense of capability in their lives, the profound level of poverty and inequality in a country like Scotland was driving demand for public services. So, and once you start to see this, when you're listening to politicians announcing something or there's increasing spending in something, and you see it through this lens, you'll see examples of it everywhere. Essentially, these are avoidable costs to our collective government services, our government agencies that could have been avoided if we had reduced poverty and inequality. So think about, for example, some of the criminal justice system, some of accident and emergency presentations, or maybe diabetes treatments, or maybe prescriptions for anti-anxiety treatments. Or here in Australia recently, the government's announced a massive increase in budget for rent assistance because people are really struggling to keep a roof over their head, homelessness, homeless shelters, and so on and so on and so on. So many of these important services, so I'm not at all denigrating them. These are really important services because they help people survive and cope with today and tomorrow, but they also are a sign of our collective failure to take care and to enable everyone to live the life they want to live. Ecological economists have a similar concept, and they call it defensive expenditure. And again, you can see the examples of defensive expenditure in everywhere, whether it's cleaning up after a massive flood, or repairing buildings after a bushfire has gone through, or payments in overtime to emergency services, or cleaning up beaches after an oil spill, and so on. And so again, just examples of spending because we'd got things wrong. And I think, Aaron, your questions have really got me thinking, because I think obviously nurses need higher salaries and better working conditions. So in a way, it's not. But if this is spending because people are leaving the profession, then perhaps we could see it. But I do think there's more layers to it in the case of nursing, and the appropriate compensation, and also the appropriate reward, because nursing is such a critical service that has such high social value that, of course, is not reflected in the market wages that go to nurses. And there's such profound, and we could talk about this for hours, I suspect, this sort of profound imbalance of the people in society who earn the most amount of money and their social value or lack of, versus the caring jobs, the jobs that keep society together, the jobs that keep our streets clean, for example. Some of the most important jobs that keep society functioning are so often paid the least. And there was a report done probably about 10, 15 years ago by a UK London-based organisation called the New Economics Foundation that started to put some numbers around that. And they compared, for example, the salaries of advertising executives, I think, from memory, with classroom assistants. And you can imagine, which is in COVID, which was the sort of function that we most needed to take care of communities, and who is the one that got paid the most. So I think there's loads of layers to it, but I think I'm really grateful to you for bringing out that concept of failure demand. And I would just encourage you to have that lens in the back of your mind every time you hear government saying, we're spending more money on this. You just think, oh, hang on a minute, is that a sign actually that society and governments and whoever's responsible hasn't got things right? I'll give one, just sorry, Aisha, I know I said I'd give brief answers. One, it was really crystallized for me, and I think I shared this last time round. I used to live in Glasgow, and I lived in this tiny little flat quite high up. So I had this amazing view of the city in my little attic, and I could see over the rooftops to a massive new fancy, very expensive hospital building. And a friend of mine came round once who was a community activist, and he said to me in his wonderful Scottish accent, he just said, Katherine, see that Queen Elizabeth Hospital there? That's 8 stories high. Maybe in a wellbeing economy, it would be 3 stories high. And I think that really captures, because people would be healthy. They would, people, of course, will still break their legs in a wellbeing economy, and they'll still give birth and need assistance and so on. But maybe some of those avoidable healthcare problems, some of those challenges because people are reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox and so on, maybe they wouldn't be as acute. That's the hope. That's what we can dare to hope for. Yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katherine. Ibrahim.
Good morning. Bushra Mubalakwe Ibrahim from Nigeria. So my question is, growth is necessary. From the book, it says the growth is necessary to address the damages caused during the growth process. If a nation possesses raw material that it cannot afford to process into finished products, so resulting into exporting the raw materials and importing the finished good becomes the norm in that country. So consequently, the nation's economy becomes heavily reliant on consumption of these finished products. So my questions are now, do you think it is economically viable for the government to subsidize such goods? And given that the economy may struggle to keep pace with the production of the essential goods, do you believe it is still sustainable to continue subsidizing these products? And lastly, what do you think will be the impact of these economic practices on early career nurses?
Thanks, Ibrahim, and wonderful to see you again. And I love that you're wearing yellow again underneath your as you were last time to match the book. Thank you. I've got two comments really, because it's a layered question, and some of the concepts are outside really the area I feel particularly well versed to respond to. But one, you talked really powerfully around the extent of government subsidies, and I think what we see in that so many societies, governments subsidise certain industries quite phenomenally. Here in Australia, the extent of subsidies to sort of fossil fuel sectors is enormous. Globally, the International Monetary Fund, so that big, fairly conservative economic institution, has mapped out and been tracking this for several years, how much, and they use the term subsidies, but what they're actually meaning is quite a broad definition of subsidies in the sense of costs imposed on third parties. So yes, the obvious subsidies of governments maybe giving money directly to the fossil fuel industry, or building equipment for them, or building roads out to, say, a coal plant or an oil well, or doing the infrastructure. So the obvious stuff. But they say they're the direct subsidies. There's also a ton and much bigger amount of indirect or implicit subsidies. And remember, this is the IMF mapping this out. And they said these are things like costs imposed downstream that other organizations pick up the bill for. And so examples like a local authority having to spend money on treating asthma because of the pollution caused by use of fossil fuels, or maybe even that same local government having to invest in cleaning up a river because the fossil fuel business upstream has been dumping or letting its pollution or its waste go into that river. And again, so on, so many examples of that. And so the IMF essentially saying, well, we should see them as subsidies too. And for several years, they've been calculating these level of subsidies. And their most recent calculation, they said that globally, that sort of subsidies comes to $7 trillion a year. So it's about 7% of global gross domestic product. It's enormous. And so it's essentially the point I want to make here is that, you know, governments subsidize a lot of things. They do invest in certain industries through subsidies. And I think the conversation that many of our societies need to have is, well, what sort of activities are aligned with what people and planet need? What sort of economic activities do we want more of? So we want to grow them, we want to nurture them, we want to expand them because they're good for us. And what do we need to really have an honest conversation about how we power them down? And I think again, this is a story, almost a conversation about huge imbalances, isn't it? This is again another example of huge amount of collective money going to an activity that is doing so much damage. The other concept I want to float, and I think we spoke about this a little bit in our discussions last time, is the idea of community wealth building. And I think it's a really exciting concept that's almost the antidote or an alternative to that sort of fierce export-led economy that you've sketched there. And community wealth building is essentially saying, instead of waiting for this idea of trickle-down economics to work, instead of sort of just hoping if the wealthier get wealthier, that it will slowly trickle down to everyone and everyone will be better, because there's loads of evidence that doesn't work. The idea of community wealth building is essentially saying, well, how about we build the economy from the community up? In my first year of economics, decades and decades ago, we talked about the concept of local economic multipliers. And it's essentially this idea that you keep money circulating locally. And so community wealth building is using levers that even local government will have to redesign the local economy. So think about it, if there's a local hospital, who they employ, who they get their catering from, who they get, say, the washing from, will determine where that money goes. And so there's been a really healthy conversation in places like Preston in the UK or Cleveland in Ohio in the US, saying, let's make sure that the people doing the catering and doing the cleaning services are locally owned and that they live locally. And so the money stays locally rather than going off out to a completely remote business. And so things like using procurement, using planning as well, really encouraging local ownership, local employment, and you can start to keep the money locally. And so that's a really nice alternative to that sort of fierce export-led, not very value-added type of economy that you're sketching there. And there's lots of great examples of community wealth building, and I can send you some resources, Ibrahim, if you're curious. So drop me an email and I can send you some examples of it in practice, because it's, you know, it's really basic economics. It's using economic levers, but it's saying what can different levels of government do to keep things going locally, rather than just leaning back on that myth of trickle-down economics.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Katherine. And I think this is a really good example of how we can become more literate here and really understand some basic principles of what you're talking about, and as solutions and as action. So rather than lots of talking, actually doing. So great questions. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to whiz on to chapter 7. And I am in Nigeria and Georgia from China. Georgia, is Georgia here? Yes, okay, you are, Georgia. Hi, Georgia. Hi. So I think I am is going first, and chapter 7 is what we might find in making ourselves at home. So I am.
Thank you so much, Professor Aisha, and hello, everyone. My name is Ayam Samuel. I'm a 50th-year nursing student at the University of Jos, Nigeria. It's amazing to be here with you all again, and thank you, Katherine, for everything you're doing. So while reading this book, I was wondering on how can this book impact my patient? As a young nurse, this is one of the things that we're being taught in the school, not just how the book will impact us nurses. I was thinking of, okay, how can I use this to impact the patient? So my question is, how can nurses in Africa contribute to reducing healthcare inequalities and promoting the fair redistribution of healthcare resources, given the diverse socioeconomic background of patients? Sorry, I'm using Africa from this context, considering the fact that this is a global book club, but I'm from Africa, so I'm trying to see how this can be used in Africa too. Thank you.
Awesome question. I am lovely to see you again. I actually can do a pretty short question here, because I think it is just keep on being the wonderful nurses that you are, or if you're still in training, that you're going to be. Help others, help your colleagues also take care of themselves so that they can keep going as nurses. I know how exhausting it can be to constantly be at the front line where demand is up here and your resources and probably often your energy levels are down here. But I think really taking care of each other to, you know, notice when people are exhausted and help them maybe have, you know, step back. The other point is around, and I suspect I probably don't need to say this on this call, but to treat all patients equally as well, because you talked about the role of nursing in sort of addressing socioeconomic inequalities, and just to really, everyone deserves the same level of healthcare regardless of their ability to pay. And so do what you can in your own sphere of influence, you know, and the choices that you are able to make. There'll be choices you can't make in your daily job, and I appreciate that. But where you can, where you feel you have ability to really make sure that everyone has the same level of care, but also, yeah, really my point around really just keep on doing what you're doing, because the health of people is also an economic factor. So the more healthy you are, the more you're able to, say, take part in a business or earn your income and, you know, travel and so on, and be part of the economic ecosystem. And the economy actually is, you know, it's really the way we share resources and so on. And so the health that you give to people and enable them to step back and participate and be part of the economy is utterly critical as well. And I guess it also goes to a point we talked about last time as well, is sort of where it's possible and where you feel safe, the collective work as unions, as nurses unions or nurses collective organizations, to maybe speak out about socioeconomic inequalities and use your very powerful voice that nurses have in really talking about the impact on health of socioeconomic inequalities. I mean, you'll probably all be familiar with the idea of the social determinants of health. Of, you know, the estimate is about 80% of people's health is a function or a factor of what happens outside the healthcare system. And so nurses have a very, very powerful voice to bring that to light and bring that to the attention of government, and really say to government, if you care about the health of people in society, we need to look at quality of wages, quality of jobs. We need to look at quality of housing. We need to look at education. We need to look at transport systems, how neighborhoods are designed. All those sorts of things will impact on people's health. And then you see them when things have gone wrong so often. So, but I think really my first point is just about keep doing what wonderful nurses do best, because that's the best thing. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love if you have any thoughts too. I'd love to hear them, because I wonder if it's one you've been thinking about, or maybe share it in the chat if you don't want to go straight away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then over to Georgia.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good evening, Dr. Trebeck, if you're in Australia. Good morning for everyone, if everyone is in Europe or other places. So reading chapter 7 inspired me so much, especially the share work, better work part. So quoting from the book, if workers have a stake as employee owners, there is no use and them, just as a rival economy would eventually move beyond this redistribution. So the old divide of workers versus managers would gradually close. And from my perspective as a registered nurse in China, what I saw, the health professionals who hold the career as their lifetime have always hold more resources than newly career nurses. And from my perspective, that's what keeps them going. And I'm really curious about how to hold more resources, maybe become a partner, associate, or shareholder in the local private hospital or nursing homes and dental and eye clinics. So I think we need to know what are the benefits to companies, organizations, stockholders, and boards of directors of giving employees access to share the access. So when negotiating and fighting for our own rights, we have the point. Thank you so much.
Georgia, thank you. And wonderful to see you again too. And thank you for the question. So those, for anyone who wasn't there last time, I think probably everyone was pretty noticed how much I love the idea of worker cooperatives and worker owners as a business model, because I think there's such that model where you have the workers owning the business, taking decisions for the business, and the business being in operation essentially with the mission to benefit those worker members. And of course, you can have community-owned cooperatives as well, or employee-owned, customer-owned cooperatives as well. So if anyone lives in the UK, the co-op shop is an example of a sort of member-owned cooperative. But worker-owned co-ops are the really powerful ones, because it's quite literally shifting the balance of power and ownership. And so we talked a little bit about that. And Georgia's really got this great question saying, well, if some of the healthcare economy and the health system is owned privately, so not delivered by government, could we perhaps have a conversation where maybe some of those healthcare actors are worker owned? And yes, we talked about last time, there'll be great benefits to the worker owners, and through democracy and often longevity of the business and better wages, because they distribute any surplus. So it's not about creating profit to then send off to remote shareholders. You generate a surplus that's then shared with the worker owners. But the question around, well, how does it benefit the business as a commercial actor, I think is a really good one. And there's lots of examples. One is that it's been shown time and time again that these sorts of businesses just stay around longer. They've got more longevity as a viable business. They don't go bust as often as other sorts of ownership structures. They're often have more input and more energy and more retention and more worker engagement from staff as well, because this is their firm. So there's a lovely story, a chap in Scotland who inherited his family business, and it was a paper making or a paper publishing firm. And he said he found it really hard to walk up and down the sort of factory, telling his staff to work harder to make more money for his family. He said, I can't motivate my staff by telling them to work harder to make more money for his already wealthy family. So he went on a journey of transferring that business to the workers. So the workers owned it. And there's what he's tapping into there is that sense of commitment and ownership and more sort of input. Less absenteeism as well has been recorded in worker ownerships when you feel it's yours, and also you have a say. So how it's operating will probably be much more aligned with what workers on the front, on the tools really need. So there's lots of benefits there. This may not be so relevant to your question, but where we see worker ownership often really come to the fore is at the point of succession. So say if someone has owned a business and they're getting to the point of retirement, and they don't want to just sell it to anyone, particularly they don't want to sell it to some stranger who just might rip it up and push workers to push down prices and so on. They want to take care of the business and they want to take care of the workers, their colleagues. That's a moment where there's often an opportunity to transfer ownership to the workers. And so it's an important juncture, and you can see the benefit there to both sides of that equation. But it's a great question, Georgia. There's a book I can recommend to you that I loved. It's an edited book with lots of different chapters called Cooperatives in a Post-Growth Era or Post-Growth World. I'll try and find it and put the link in the chat if no one else is able to very quickly. But I think you'll if you're intrigued by co-ops, I think you'll like reading it, Georgia.
Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Oh, God, I'm getting so excited. So good. I can't, honestly, it's so good. I've got so many ideas in my head. I don't know about everyone else, but my head's going to explode in a minute. This is brilliant. Okay, but I can't explode right at this moment. See Jill just thinking, Aisha, can you just get on with this? But we are now going to chapter 10. We're going to have a big debrief after this. Chapter 10, Hassan, from my favourite country, Sudan. From individual initiatives to wider change, agitation, amplification. Oh, I love those words. From individual initiatives to wider change, agitation, amplification, and attention. Oh, so good. Okay, Hassan, over to you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Katherine, and thank you for everyone who joined today. My question is simple. Moving from the GDP to Almighty Cousins and Mahbub al-Haq HDI, we in the realm of development practice do actually need kind of a tool, to measure our progress. This tool need to be robust and need to be able to measure the progress on the nation and the country-wise. This tool also need to be reflective to the community needs and orientation. However, the current status quo of the GDP often protected by the competitive nature of the global economy, which emphasizes scarcity over abundance. You, as an arrival economist and theorist, how do you think a change in this system could be implemented within communities and imposed upon governments and private entities, particularly in contexts where democracy and state institutions aren't functioning very well? Additionally, how do you think this could contribute to the decolonization of the global order without being perceived as a utopian, like economist notion?
Oh man, we should talk for hours about this one because there is a lot in there. Hassan, awesome to see you again too, and thanks for the brilliant question, or multi-layered question, which I know I'm not going to do justice to in my brief. Well, actually, there's a lot I want to say, so it won't be entirely brief, but it will still just be catching the surface of it. So I want to pick up where you finished around the sort of decolonizing aspect. So folks probably heard of gross domestic product, and it came out. It was sort of created in the Depression, the sort of Second World War era, by an economist in the US called Simon Kuznets. And basically, they needed something to measure the impact of the New Deal that President Roosevelt was bringing about to show, is this making a difference in the economy? And then, of course, it became something to see the impact of mobilization and changing the economy for the war effort. Kuznets said, you can never measure, and these are his words, you can't measure the welfare of an economy through using GDP. And yet what happened is that in the Second World War era, when you had this sort of Cold War versus the West, it became the measure that both countries were trying to sort of both realms of the world were trying to outcompete each other. You then had some international institutions forming around the idea of GDP growth. So Bretton Woods and groups like the IMF were really using the sort of GDP lens to as a proxy for economic power and therefore political importance. And you now see, you know, rankings of, you know, what's a developed country? It's on the basis of gross domestic product, usually measured per capita. The big sort of geopolitical groupings, things like the G20, the G7, you know, we're just having the sort of Italy hosting the G7 meeting at the moment. And what's the entry ticket for those big, powerful clubs? It's basically how big is your GDP? Even the BRICS group was formed when there was a group of certain countries whose GDP per capita was moving at a certain pace at that period of time. And yet this is against all the warnings of the creator. Even since 1968, Robert Kennedy, who was running for president, it was a couple of months before he was assassinated, he does this beautiful speech. And if you haven't listened to his speech, go onto YouTube, because I put it to music, you know, schmaltzy American music, and turn up the volume, because it's a beautiful poetic tirade against gross domestic product. And he basically says GDP measures the ambulances cleaning up crashes on our highways, our divorces, the size of our prison systems, but it doesn't measure the beauty of children reading or our beautiful national parks. And then he says it measures, in essence, everything but that which makes life worthwhile. I'll show you with you another quote that I love from my friend who's a Canadian economist, Mark Anelski, and he says, in GDP terms, the hero is a terminal cancer patient who's going through an expensive divorce, who crashes his car on the way to his job as an arms dealer because he's texting while eating a takeaway hamburger. Now, every single one of those activities is going to increase GDP, isn't it? But that's not the sort of activities that are going to bring about healthy communities, not the sort of person we want to work next to or hang out with on the weekend. And so it just shows this sort of real misalignment between our default measures of progress and this sort of economy to create the sort of society we want. So I love that you've put your finger on sort of the measurement, because measurements do matter. It's not the only thing. Lots of governments around the world have much broader measurements, and they're called multidimensional measurement frameworks. And over half of the OECD countries, the sort of rich club countries, have these multidimensional wellbeing frameworks. Australia just relaunched its one last year called Measure What Matters. They're not enough on their own. And so the key thing is we need to have them to see how we're tracking, but then we need to make those measures matter. We need to change and mobilize government policy making, government evaluation, different ways of working to pay attention to them. So one, if you take off your GDP lens, when you're looking at the world with your GDP glasses, you see those big countries in like the US, you know, Canada, Australia, Italy, and so on, those big countries that themselves have plenty of problems. You know, if you think about what sort of country do you want to live in, tell you what, it's not necessarily those countries that with the most massive GDP. It's definitely not the US for all sorts of reasons that sorry if anyone's from the US here. I'm sure there are beautiful parts, but you know the sort of, you know, social and health and economic problem and you know, environmental problems in the US. You take off those lenses and you put on well-being economy lenses, or, you know, making yourselves at home lenses, suddenly you see a whole suite of different countries. And the one we talk about quite a bit in the book is Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is, in GDP terms, a sort of lower middle income country, but it has a higher level of life expectancy than its big US neighbor. It has got a very preventative healthcare system. It's been really successful in the last few years in terms of reforesting its landscape, bringing back, protecting biodiversity. You'll love this one. They have no army. And I mean, they do have quite a strong police force, but their constitution, they have banned an army, and instead they have in their constitution to put 8% of their GDP into education. And so, yes, they still have problems. There's still inequality, but there's quite good public services to take care of each other, and that, you know, no wonder they have a higher level of life expectancy. So you sort of take away your GDP lens and put on different glasses, and you see different heroes. And I think this goes to your point around decolonization. There is no sort of hierarchy or relationship between the bigger your GDP and having all the answers. We can see answers and solutions and ideas and brilliant practice from around the world. Aisha, I'm going to just go a little bit further in this, and I know we've got a breakout discussion that I'm really excited about, but the other point, Hassan, I think you hinted at, is the need to mobilize a wider conversation amongst the general public around these measures, not just have it a sort of technical kind of debate. And I often say, you know, when you build these measurement frameworks, you have indicators and you have, you know, you call them a dashboard. Most normal people who are not policy geeks like me, when they're talking about indicators and dashboards, they're talking about their car. They're not talking about their quality of life or the sort of country they want their children to grow up in. And so I think what we need is measures of progress that, yes, correlate really strongly to key aspects of quality of life for the planet, for the future, and for communities today. But they also have to pass a second test, and that's that they have to make really intuitive sense to the community in question. And maybe, Aisha, this is something we could do as a group together down the track. And I have this dream that we could, as a community, or it might be a community of practice like us here today, or it might be a local community and a community of place, but to come up with measures that speak to key aspects of quality of life but also resonate in and of themselves. And the example I give, and I hold my hand up, I've never tested this, but this is just my hunch that this one might be one that works, is imagine if, say, your city, the mayor was saying, under my watch, I'm not going to focus on the city equivalent of GDP. I'm going to focus on measures such as the number of girls who ride their bikes to school. Because if you think about it, if that figure is going up, what has to be in place? So parents have to have enough money to buy a bike and to provide breakfast for their daughters. So there's a certain level of financial sufficiency there. Streets need to be safe, not polluted. Local schools as well. So there's something about service provision as well. And maybe we could have 4 or 5 other ones, and together they start to paint a pretty cool picture of the sort of society we want to live in and we want to, you know, give to our children and our grandchildren. And then I think we could really build momentum around having a public conversation saying to our elected officials, we want you to focus on this stuff, not GDP per capita or the Gini coefficient or parts per million, but the really sort of these things that really resonate. Because I think the key thing in this conversation, there's no shortage of indicators. There's lots of new indexes and different beyond GDP measures, but they're not resonating. And we need to build a sort of more public mobilization around this. So Hassan, I think this happened last time you asked this great question. I just went off on talking and talking. So thank you again for your brilliant question, Aisha. I will stop there.
Okay, brilliant. I mean, so many great things coming out here and so many ideas, and we definitely have to do something about this. And do you know what really struck the chord? This mobilization and discussion with the public, I think I keep saying it, is the missing key of all of this, because at the moment they are, I don't know what it is, inertia, I don't know, but we need to stimulate them. And we did this small piece of work around alcohol, is one of my fields of research. And we were looking at core outcome set for an instrument that we could measure. It's kind of one of the things that you talk about quality of life. But we also then went to look at the literature and see what people said, people who experience alcohol-related harm. And they talked about, they didn't talk about EQ5, the economic element, they didn't talk about the QALY, they didn't talk about, their liver function test. They talked about happiness. They said it's happiness, it's going out and seeing colour in the world. And it was all, and how do you measure these things? And it was just like it just kind of made me stop and think those are the things that are really important, because as you say, they mean something else and so many other things to that person's life that must be happening if they feel happiness and they can see the color again and everything and taste everything and feel and breathe. I mean, it's just wonderful. But we have got breakouts, so I'm stopping talking now because Hannah will be in the background having we kind of shock system going on if we carry on. But
Sorry,
I'm
Hannah.
loving the discussion. I'm loving the discussion. It's so good. And honestly, Katherine,
I
I
was
could
gonna
listen to you all day.
I was going to, I think, set up the breakout groups with a little bit of a sense of sort of how change happens. Yeah, thanks, Hannah. If you
Yeah.
just pull that up. I'll really rattle through this as best I can. This is something called the multi-level system perspective, and I find it really helpful in thinking about how we might collectively, as a community of change agents, work on different aspects of transforming the economic system into one that's better aligned with what people and planet need. So it's from a scholar called Frank Giles, and he says, in any system, you get these different levels to it, these different layers. One is that what he calls landscape, I call sort of the paradigm, the perspectives level of how we think about the economy. Things like maybe technology would come into play here, the state of the environment, but it's really the questions we're allowed to ask about the economy and the assumptions that we have and how we're sort of boxed into thinking about the economy, the way we tend to think that the only way of development is just more and more growth. So that's one layer. It's really at the level of mindset. The next one underneath there is the rules of the game. So this is the policy regime where government policymakers design subsidies or taxes or regulations, those sorts of things that shape different economic behaviors. And then underneath that is what I'd call the pioneers. And this is sort of the individual practices. They could be businesses, they could be community initiatives. And the key thing is, you see the arrows here, they all inspire or constrain or spark different conversations at different levels of the system. And I just find this really helpful way to think about how change happens. So Hannah, if you just click to the next slide, and there's a couple of sort of slide-ins for what sort of activity would happen at each level. So the first one here, if we're working at, say, the grassroots, if this is where our energy takes us, for example, is the sort of grassroots niche level, it might be supporting new models. So the sort of conversation Georgia and I had around co-ops might be activity there, supporting these cool pioneers that demonstrate what it looks like. The next one, if we're working at the policy regime, wanting to work with politicians and people in governments to change legislation, to change behavior, there's sort of different activities there. And then just click the last one. And this is kind of what we're doing today, is really thinking about what different questions can we ask about the economic system and give ourselves permission to ask bigger questions about the purpose of the economy. So there's all sorts, no one person, of course, can act at all those levels. You've got to find your place. And so that comes to the next slide. If you can just click the next slide, Hannah. This is a beautiful, I think, mapping from Charles Lee Beater and Jane Winnall, and they're sort of systems change experts. And what they've done is they've mapped out here some of the different types of activities that we need to be playing in changing the economic system here. No one can do it all on their own. It says these are the sort of different activities. We need commissioners, consumers, people to scale up core practice, people to convene discussions like this, people who work on the inside and then the outside of maybe the government system, people who are entrepreneurs who are setting up and creating those new practices, people who are just investing in new different ways of doing things, but maybe not doing it themselves. They're the sort of different activities. And I think the exciting thing is it shows that, again, no one can do it all on their own, but you can find your place and you listen to your energy, where you get angry, where you feel your skill sets are, to find your different role on these different, all the different roles that are needed to change the system. And then Hannah, if you can just go to the next slide. This is a post-it note that someone put on a workshop I was at many, many years ago. And I think to me, it just sums up, and all of you are change agents. You're here having these conversations. And I think this sums up the task that's ahead of us really beautifully. It says, catalyzing large-scale change is difficult, but it is achieved through relationships, the sort of things we're building now, championships, so really celebrating the cool pioneers that show what different looks like, legitimacy, so, who are we speaking for? What's our mandate? patience, because this is certainly no easy task. Purpose, so this is really keeping an eye on what's our vision and what's the goal. And passion, because we have to keep going when the system bites back and the system is very, very hard to change. And I just want to leave that with you, because that's something I love this post-it note as terms of, you know, a reminder of what we have to carry with us in this journey of changing the economic system. Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks, Aisha.
Brilliant. So I think automatically now, oh, I think I'm muted. Can people hear me?
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Lovely. We are going to be, I think, magically put into our breakout groups, which I think Hannah is going to do. Jill, thank you so much. Jill's got to pop off and leave us, but I'm so glad that you've been representing our region way down there, Jill. But you're here flying the flag, as are all our colleagues. So thank you for joining us. Okay, we're now in our little groups, in our breakout groups. So we'll be in here. I don't know if everyone can hear me. I think we're in here for about 10 minutes. Is
maybe
that
10 minutes? Yeah, 10
minutes. Yeah, maybe 10, because we finish at 10:30. So that's great.
And can I just add, before we go off to those breakout rooms, so this question is around really thinking about the different types of change that people might want to bring, and then also how they can support others, how they can be, you know, take care of each other, what they can contribute to the change efforts of others. One thing to bear in mind in your group is we're wanting to hear back from you. So just keep in mind that someone will going to probably come off mute and share some of your discussion. So keep that in mind in your groups.
Thank you. Okay, so you should have a link to join our room. So please click on the link and join.
Aisha, do you want me to just invite people to report back briefly?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Katherine.
Three groups, just so I think we had 3 groups. Is that roughly? Was there a 4th group? Was anyone in group number 4?
We were in group 4. We were put into group 4. I think maybe so, but maybe Hannah can just pop that in the chat. But we can start maybe with the first group.
Yeah, so maybe just like a minute and a half each, just some of the sorts of things that you were thinking about in terms of, different contributions to change at different parts of the system. So someone from the group that was called group 1?
No, Katherine, we were in group 1, and then we were transported into group. There were 4 groups, but lots of people ended up in 2 of the groups. So I think we had group 4, and then the other group was maybe group 2 or group 3. Can somebody just let me know what the other group number was?
Maybe instead of going through them 1, 2, 3, 4, I'll just let people who would like to report back just come off mute and report back. So who would like to go first?
Well, I think in our group,
I start to comment it and was disconnected.
okay, Nala, I think who was the person who was feeding back in group 4, the group that I was in? So who was that?
Jane. I spoke with Jane. I'm in the group of Jane.
Okay. Maren, were you feeding back?
No,
Okay.
his line is Aaron.
Yes, so I think in our breakup group, we talked about first on the information transparency. So
Mhm.
what instruments, what items we use, where are they made,
Mhm.
how the 5 W's of those, how I haven't got the chance to type it down first. But and then we talked about how we should ground it a lot of things locally. So so it's about the groundedness, the lived experience, the phenomenology. I love it. And then we ended up with education. So it's about resource utilization and distribution of like introducing more of a preceptor, because like a preceptorship, preceptee, the system is long established, and it could bring like shed light on the education aspect of how we can support the economic system. Yes.
Brilliant. I love that. Who would like to go next? Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, please. Can I?
Yeah, Nala, go for it.
Okay. Thank you. My comments for the group will be reported from Jane, but my comments when I joined the second group with Prof. Aisha, what I want to state, I like your slide, Catherine. When you put in the slide as the second point, so we need to start to fill the gap between the high economic countries and low economic countries. And I use the example of heat action, of heat waves with the climate change now. So heat stroke happen in high economical country, the same heat stroke happen in the low income country. So the same principle rules of preventive measures and for the treatment measures, nurses will implement the same rules, regardless of the economical status. So what I recommended from this webinar that you put the rules, you put the policies and distribute it to institutions, hospitals, academia, and the societies in each country. So it will become like a rules for the government, a rules for the organizations, a rules for those who doesn't listening to the nurses' voice. It will be okay. This nursing now challenge or WHO is to distribute this to countries and you give them time frame. This policy number 1 should be followed. We need the feedback. When did you start it? Who is the focal person in that area? And then we can follow by research later for more feedbacks. But if it will come like this, we will be working on the gap between the organizations and between the communities, regardless of the economical status. Then second point will be which economic, why, if I'm teaching heat action, I make a lesson in the YouTube. If you find time, you can go to that. So I distribute it as a contributor to IFRC Climate Center in Houston. So I make this session, the same rules will be implemented in Australia, will be implemented in Sudan, will be implemented in South Africa. And who is implementing it for us? As the community provider and advocate. So if we have the same principle for knowledge, one will be affected by the economical status. You get my points there? And thank you for taking care of the economic file in the world.
Thanks, no, that's awesome.
Thank you, Katherine, and thank you, Prof. Aisha. It's really good opportunity. Really, I'm very happy that you touch very sensitive, because when we are in the ground, it's different from when we have that textbook coming from the universities. When I'm a university lecturer, so sometimes I teach the student in the lab. When they go to the hospital, they didn't find the equipments. I teach postgraduate how to do ACLS, and when they go to that hospital doesn't buy even the DC shock machine. So This is the
Brilliant.
problems now.
Thank you so much for those reflections.
Welcome.
So we've got 3 minutes left. And I know we've got at least one more, maybe two more people. So Sam, do you want to go next?
Shall I jump? So some of the themes that emerged within the discussion in our group was engaging in discussion and action like cooperative to catalyze the system, building a resilient impact, finding like-minded people and then sharing and engaging together, and then moving to find support. This would make the process easier. Again, we need to communicate that this participatory approach is somehow needed to impact the system as whole. So this one of the recommendation. Also, to work with communities from the bottom to top, using bottom to top approach and understanding the communities and acknowledge the different contexts in which communities are functioning, because no one size fits all. And then creating some sustainable businesses to support our work, our charity work, our own development work, and then we can move to helping other, maybe providing fund for them, maybe engaging them in different ways, as well. A theme around having a balance between the needs and the actions is emerged. And one last point was around the gap in the nursing needs versus supply, and the reflection of this gap on how investment directed to the nurses. And it was a call for a redistribution of resources among professions. I hope I captured everything.
That was superb. It was such a great chat. So then was there a fourth group? Is there anyone else who'd like to feedback from a conversation who feels that their discussion hasn't been heard yet? Otherwise, I'll pass back to you, Aisha.
Brilliant. Okay, I've just put my conclusion in the chat in case we all got cut off. But just to say, thank you so much to everyone for joining. You will be able to watch this again on the recording on YouTube. Please stay in touch. If you've got any thoughts, let us know, because we need to hear your ideas. Your ideas will be the things that we can take forward. We are going to send out certificates of attendance to everyone who attended today, because we feel that's very useful for professional development and for you to keep on your record for your registration, and acknowledging the time that you've spent taking part in this really important topic. There's so much still to do, Katherine. It's been absolutely wonderful. We have got lots of ideas, and we will take that back with the group who are here. And Katherine said, if anyone wants an electronic copy of the book, please email and she'll send it over to you. Keep talking, keep listening, and let us know, most of all, what you would like us to do next. And thank you so much to our wonderful early career nurses who posed those amazing questions, and were just absolutely amazing. Don't tell the publisher about getting the book. It has been divine. That's the word, Katherine. Absolutely divine and wonderful. And I just think we need to do so much more in this topic area and make it accessible to more of our network. So we're going to try and work on how we can do that. I'm thinking boots, I'm thinking advocacy, I'm thinking all sorts of things, and I know you all are too. So thank you again for joining us. It's been wonderful as always, an inspiring Friday, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Keep doing what you're doing. It's amazing. You're not on your own. We are with you and we are together. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.